Well, hi, everybody joining us. The room here is filling up. My name is Jake Milstein, joined by April Murdoch and Mike Hamilton, and another fellow, John Luke Peck, will be joining us here in a second. We'll get started in about a minute as people dial in, click in, whatever it is we do these days. We were just talking about ways that we've caffeinated up for this and found out that
insufficiently.
Yeah, there's John Luke. Found out that that Mike is going to switch to herbal tea, which I think is good for all of us, and that
Not yet.
and April, you want to tell them how you caffeinate?
Chocolate covered espresso beans.
Chocolate covered espresso beans. So I have to say to everybody as we begin this that April is absolutely smarter than the rest of us and has done this right.
I'll agree with that.
Especially since my family took all the Nespresso pods and finished them and didn't tell me. So anyway, yep, we're just going to give people another 30 seconds here. Of course, today we're going to be talking about the Tyler Technologies breach and the risk that that's created and what folks should be doing. We'll try to keep the caffeine chatter to a minimum. But remember that that we're in Seattle, so caffeine and espresso are really at the top of the list of things we talk about. Over on the right side of your screen, there's a chat. Feel free to chat questions. There's also a questions tab where you can put in questions. As people join, I'll mention that again. Since we're about a minute in here and we have a lot of people here, let me share my screen and we will get started. All right. Well, I assume I'm not muted because people haven't said anything. Hey, you're muted. So we'll start. So the Tyler Technologies breach on September 23rd last week, Tyler announced it got hit with ransomware. Tyler services 15,000 government offices across the U.S., across every state, Canada, the Caribbean, and Australia. Ransom EXX appears to be responsible. And according to Tyler, internal phone and information technology systems were attacked. According to the statement on their site and some things reported in media, the environment where we host software for our clients is separate and segregated from our internal corporate environment. However, because we've received reports of several suspicious logins to client systems, we believe precautionary password resets should be implemented. And so here to talk about it today, April Murdoch, InfoSec Manager for Seattle Public Schools, Mike Hamilton, CISO and founder of CI Security, John Luke Peck, Cyber Risk Consultant in the public sector. And again, I'm Jake Milstein, been a journalist for a long time and now work with Mike at CI Security. I run marketing, so don't ask me the cyber questions. That's what they're all here for. So April, let's start with you on the first question here. So why is this breach at Tyler Technologies a bigger deal than other breaches this year?
Well, one of the reasons is the scope, right? It touches, at least in my context for K-12, it touches big districts. For instance, we have Versatrans. And it also seems to touch a number of smaller districts, like the Infinite Vision stuff. You can actually see the list. If you look at the Wikipedia for Tyler Tech, you can see a massive list of applications that they support in the field. So they have a large reach. The other thing that we were talking about amongst ourselves, sort of on the back channel, we have other K-12 cybersecurity folks, and we talk back and forth, is the different ways that Tyler got into our systems to do their work. And some of those were obvious, maybe VPN accounts, but some of them are less obvious, like exposed SQL ports or exposed RDP ports. And so we were a bit anxious that our normal process for looking at, does company X still have access? Assuming that they've been ransomed or at risk to some degree, that list kept getting longer and longer about the things that we needed to look at and be careful about. It made us actually revisit our incident response plan. and realize that there's some fields in there that probably should be updated, like which firewall ports might be open for any particular vendor, or what are all of the system accounts that that vendor might know and have passwords for, that kind of thing. So the list for this one seems to be longer than most for us.
And, you know, one of the things April mentioned there with things to do, one of the things that we hope everybody with us today on this recorded webinar gets out of this is some steps to take, some new information as we go forward here. You know, Mike, I know you've spent a lot of time looking at this breach. What do we know?
So first of all, let me agree with April. You know, our purpose for being here is to, you know, very carefully talk about what we actually know, make it clear when we are suggesting an implication as a possibility, not something that's happened. So in terms of what we know, okay, so Tyler was hacked and it's ransomware. Okay, we know that. That's been reported in the media. And as you know, Tyler is now recommending that you lock out Tyler logins, which is something that as soon as this was announced, and we saw that they had put out a public statement, which is, you know, typical of these things, which is a little unspecific. You know, the fact that there were actors inside and the fact that it very could have been for quite a while, with all of the ability to log into on-premise government systems. You know, this is why I kind of picked this up right away and started looking at this. The other reason is that we had been working with one of our customers who brought this to our attention, the lack of multi-factor authentication in one of the applications called Munis, which is an enterprise resource planning system for local government. So because of all of that, we started to dig, and then we found the same things. I mean, they were reported in the media, but there have been a couple of uploads to VirusTotal of encrypted files with the extension TylerTech. There's some question as to when that exactly happened. I think it was reported at first by a researcher at, I think, Emisoft, who said it was June, but we can't confirm that. So the encryption scheme apparently is indicative of this ransom EXX variant, which has been implicated in 3 known ransomware attacks. So, and by the way, this is a relatively new ransomware kit. It's a derivative of something called Defray 777. If you're, you know, in that swim lane and that means something to you. But Konica Minolta, a photonics a company that does high performance laser development, and notably the Texas Department of Transportation, all got hit with this particular variant. So those are the things we actually know. And from that point on, we have talked with some people who have performed penetration testing and security assessments on Tyler products, and largely because it has become a trend, a tactic to use these managed service providers as the jumping off spot to get to a lot of targets. I think a lot of people might remember not that long ago, there were 23 cities in Texas that all got hit with ransomware simultaneously because their managed service provider had been compromised and used as that launching point. So if it's 23 cities, that's really bad. If it's thousands, that's really bad. So, you know, out of an abundance of caution, I think it is incumbent on us to take what we know and think about what the implications could be here, and then suggest some actions to take. So that's kind of what we know up to this point. And there are, again, some things that we're going to disclose here that we have been told. And this is, I want to be clear, 2-year-old penetration testing information that we have received from somebody who does this type of work and was forthcoming about this. But I'm going to cut it off there and say that's what we know.
Good. Thanks, Mike. And April, does that match your understanding so far of what we know here?
It does. And one of the reasons I'm here is I want to make sure that everybody is taking precautions. It may be a bit of an overreach at times, but we need to look at what we know and be as careful as we can. Use the opportunity to improve your plans. Use the opportunity to review those audit logs and see how far back you can go. Maybe it is June, maybe it is only September, but if you can go back to June, all the better. So there's a lot of opportunity here to help each other out and be in a better place.
Yeah.
And I hope this is a fire drill. I'm concerned it may not be, but either way, it's a good exercise.
Yeah, and in terms of sharing what folks are doing, Nathan in the chat here says another thing we're highly concerned about is Tyler's IMS service, which automatically downloads software updates directly from Tyler. We've shut down all instances of IMS in our environment. So I think people in the chat here, feel free to share things that you've done. And Michael shares, just throwing this out there as another thing to consider. Are you concerned that Tyler had backup copies of your databases for testing and like, could those have been compromised? So, some other questions there. John Luke, you do a lot of work in the public sector. What's your take?
So there are a number of risks to be looking at and thinking about here. There's absolutely, like you noted from the chat here, if it's standard practice for this organization to not only have an open direct line into your database server, but also to have backup copies of those databases, that changes the risk model. And there are definitely additional risks to be at least concerned of and watching there. Now, again, I want to clarify, we don't know the full extent of what's happened during the course of this. So we don't know, for example, if backup data on their premises is at risk, but I think it's safe to infer there is definitely a risk there. So good questions to be asking when they reach out to you or you start getting in touch with them. As far as technical recommendations for what to do, first and foremost is taking a look at your open firewall, the firewall that handles your internet traffic in and out of your organization, and in particular, the port forwards or NAT exposures that you've got, things like RDP and port 1433 for SQL. It's 2020. Anybody working in IT and cybersecurity has heard of and seen the risks of RDP being exposed to the internet at large. We definitely recommend not doing so. So if you have RDP being forwarded to the internet to a Tyler system or service, or even to a terminal server or a gateway server or something, strongly consider pulling that down. Or take a look at other authentication mechanisms and other security controls to help tighten that up. Things like multi-factor authentication. We strongly advocate for the use of terminal server gateways and remote desktop gateway servers if you need to allow essentially remote clients to get into your organization and a VPN is not an option for whatever reason. We've heard that 1433 might be open directly to Tyler, meaning that if they sent you a configuration guide and your engineers put into a firewall, we're going to allow this SQL server to be exposed, but only to these public IP addresses. That's better than nothing, but there's still risk there. We would recommend making sure that those systems are either the NAT port forwards are either disabled outright, or that you've taken a look at the connection logs and the activity to make sure that everything there is on the up and up. Those are the very direct risks based on what we know about. Then it expands to kind of a second level of risk. Take a look at your vendor logins, any third-party systems, any third-party accounts, VPN accounts, direct administrator accounts. I've lost count of the number of incident response engagements we've done over the last 6 months, which resulted from a vendor or a service provider using one shared account amongst dozens of individual contractors. And all it takes is one of them losing that password. And then all of their work is A, at risk, and B, now your networks and systems are at risk. Another thing that we recommend is taking a look at the risk indicators from Tyler systems and software servers running in your environment. Take a look at admin access, who's logged in when. Take a look at program execution logs, make sure that only expected EXEs and programs have been running. If you've got anti-malware systems or an EDR platform, something like Defender ATP or Red Cloak from SecureWorks, for example, those are really good to review and just make sure that only legit software and only the expected programs are able to run. Another thing that I'm going to recommend, which we don't see enough people doing, but is a good indicator of somebody being in your network and siphoning data out, is take a look at your overall ISP traffic stats. if your normal background noise of internet traffic is, let's say, a terabyte a month, and in the last week your network has pushed out, say, 2 terabytes worth of data, there's something there that's worth investigating. We've done a number of incidents here recently where that's been a telltale indicator and it didn't get seen in time. So if you're concerned that you've got somebody inside your network and data is being moved around, that is a very good indicator. I've got a few more recommendations, but we can go into that a little bit later.
Well, and so Craig types a question, what about the service accounts for applications like New World where Tyler said not to change the password?
Yeah, so anything where the vendor knows the password is a risk. We see a couple of things on that front. One is either they've got a password management system, so if the password is, knock on wood, unique to your environment, but the vendor has it, that's being stored somewhere. That may be in a contractor's head, that may be in a developer's head, or it may be in an Excel spreadsheet or a text file on their network, but I would consider that password to be at risk. The other thing that we've seen is they oftentimes use shared passwords. I say they as in vendors. We don't know this 100% for sure about Tyler at the moment, but it is common practice for software vendors, service provider vendors, even some consulting groups. I will say very plainly, not CI security. We make sure that our passwords are all different, but some security services providers or contracting providers use a single common password. And so that means that their vendor account could be used by a number of people, but ultimately one password is going to let an attacker using the remote systems into potentially dozens or hundreds of clients. And so that's why we recommend just disabling their accounts short term. If it's a service account that's powering the infrastructure internally, you can do things to make sure that that service account can't be accessed by VPN, for example, make sure that it's not something that you can log into from outside the network or the environment. And then if possible, and I fully recognize the amount of effort that could come along with this, change the service account passwords. We do recommend setting a maintenance window for that and making sure that your IT teams go through the prep exercises, because it's very easy to break stuff unexpectedly when you go changing service account passwords. But in this case, I think that's an important and prudent step.
So, and I have to, I have to tell people, when somebody calls our 800 number for an incident response thing on Saturday night at 11 p.m., I'm the one who picks it up. So everybody listen to this because I don't want to hear.
Yeah, and then you call John Luke and he's got to go somewhere.
That's true. I do.
Mm-hmm.
That's why we have coffee at the ready.
So I want to talk about some of these other things that we understand.
And April had one thing. April, did you want to add to that?
So it's more rumor than real, but I have heard that there was common administrator accounts and common passwords used for some installs. Not ours, but I have heard that that has happened. So don't know how far back that goes, but it's worth a serious consideration.
Mike.
So let me put some detail around this, because some of the things John Luke alluded to and what April just talked about, we actually have some information that supports that. So again, Penetration Tester has been doing work with Tyler customers and assessing the security of those installed applications. And, basically from an architectural level. So what we were told is that 1433 is open to Tyler. Okay, that's a SQL port. That means that if you were inside Tyler's network, you had an open connection to a database. And this database, specifically the one that we heard about, is a product called Tyler Connect. That is a finance and accounting system. So it is possible, I'm not saying this has happened, but I think the opportunity was there to siphon off all the data in those systems silently. And remember that the tactic being used right now, double extortion, is if you don't pay us the ransom, all the records we stole we're going to make public. And so that might be an indicator if you detect that a large transmission went over to Tyler on 1433 that can't be explained. That might be the data that's being stolen that's going to be used to extort you later. We also found out this penetration tester did some brute force password guessing on that open 1433, and without specificity, I will say that the choice of username and password was not only really simple, but it is highly unlikely that the recovered password was unique to that customer. It was of a simple form that is something super easy to remember, and I do not think that that was individual to that customer. So that is suggestive of credential management. And again, this is 2-year-old information. That is suggestive of a type of credential management that could lend itself to single passwords being used. Now, I want to follow that up by saying I have heard from 2 public safety jurisdictions in Washington state, and the practices that are being used there for remote access by vendors is exemplary. It's known when they come and go. They did not allow them to use default passwords. They use a brokered connection to come in, so they're not actually connected directly to systems. All that stuff is top shelf. I don't think your basic cities and counties, especially the smaller ones, are doing. The larger ones that have maybe a security team and somebody to evaluate third parties and practices, they're maybe doing that. So if they were in and they grabbed credentials, and there's a lot of them that are shared, this could end up in 23 cities in Texas. Now, the other thing was we were told that Tyler required customers to have 3389 open to the internet, not to Tyler, to the internet. So that's remote desktop protocol, which is a protocol that right now is being pounded like crazy because of the pandemic, and everybody's working at home, needs remote access, and it's well known that that is under attack.
So the good news here is that that didn't happen to us. So I'm hoping that was an old habit.
Yeah.
But did you notice the note by Billy Buckhorn and about the passwords and their patterns?
No.
So this is in the chat here, and I'll read this. This is a comment on a internet website, so we don't know if this is true. Remember, the point of this is just so we share knowledge so that folks are aware of changes they could make in case this is worse than what it looks like on the Tyler website so far. So the posts are in the chat here. It says their security was woefully. This is a former employee.
Wow.
They were the former employee. Their security was woefully inadequate. When I left there 2 years ago, highly sensitive CGIS data protected by one-word passwords. You all can read the rest.
I don't know how reliable that is, right? So I know where that comes from. That is a comment to the Krebs article, right? Krebs on Brian Krebs. That is definitely something we need to look at, but in terms of being a validated piece of information, I'd be a little suspicious about that.
Yeah,
but it seems to fit the pattern that we have observed in what we see, and with talking to somebody who's got inside knowledge.
And April, you were just talking about for Seattle schools, things that you noticed. Tell us about what you noticed, your experience with this.
In our environment, it's actually been pretty good. We don't have firewall exposed roles. SQL is not exposed. They only came in when we invited them in. So I'm a little less worried. We're still probably going to change the service accounts because it looks like that wasn't our password standard, which probably implies it was their password standard. But overall, I'm not as freaked out. That said, I'm certainly looking at the use of that service account across our organization. I'm looking at all of the logs back to June to figure out what normal source IP addresses are for any of the traffic. And we're assuming that there is risk. That doesn't mean there is. I think they actually did a pretty good job with us. But that said, I have to be careful. Because that server lives on a network with other servers. And although we have some east-west controls, it's not absolute. So,
April, you just touched on something which I think is super important to call out. We've heard this espoused from Kirk Bailey, who is the former CISO for the University of Washington for near on the last 20 years or so. And I keep trying to get this good word out there. Assume breach. Assume the risk is there. It's okay to be proven wrong in the end, but at least you will have taken a look at it with those eyes. You will have examined the risk, the incident, the potential concerns from the mindset of how bad could this be if this is already happening. Now with this, I personally would not jump to the assumption that I've got somebody inside my network, but I would jump to the assumption that I certainly could have somebody inside my network and you need to take action accordingly. But yeah, the assume breach mindset, we are huge proponents of that, and it has served many organizations very well over the last 20 years.
Well, so I was gonna say,
hang on,
people...
April, I got a question for you too. Oh, go ahead, Jake.
Go ahead, Mike.
Okay, you touched on something here I want to drill into a little bit. So you said Tyler did a pretty good job with you. Did you drive standards? Did they drive standards? For, like credential management, managing when they came in on remote access, logging, mapping back to a person and not a role account, things like that. Did you drive that, or was that their standard practice?
It was actually a partnership.
Okay.
We tend to be a little bit more strict than some school districts might, in part because we have dedicated security folks. But I think Tyler has participated and been supportive of our asks. So, and I think their standard is no longer remote RDP. I think they've actually moved to a different model.
Yeah. Didn't we read that they were installing something called BOMGAR recently, and there were actually a couple of jurisdictions that were freaked out because they didn't know why this was being installed, and it's a known kind of remote access tool, a RAT. Is that what they are using for you?
They have, but and that's where the partnership comes in. We install it when they need it, and we remove it when they're done.
Got it.
And they use that tool as needed, but no more than needed. So.
So that practice is fantastic. And April, kudos to you and your team there. I will say I've done assessments for other public agencies, large and small, where vendors and service providers, just like Tyler, were granted a always-on VPN account with domain admin rights to not. Yeah, exactly. And there was little to no monitoring of what they were doing. They just needed domain admin in order to get something up and running. So it was given to them once years ago, and nobody thought to pull it back. And meanwhile, you could have people logging in at 2 a.m. from around the world using those creds, and nobody's getting alerts. Nobody's seeing reports about that. So that's why we go back to take a look at your user logs, take a look at your sign-in logs, take a look at the antivirus or the program execution logs from these systems. Assume breach, take a look at the evidence, and make sure that you can rule it out rather than assuming everything's fine. But there's a lot of indicators to examine for to understand whether these credentials or those systems are actually at risk or have been utilized.
Yeah, William in the comment here, I think, brings up something really smart. Generally, vendors will be cooperative, collaborative, and respectful of your cyber practices, but almost only after you ask. And Mike, I know when you talk to vendors of our company, this is something you ask all the time.
Yeah. I don't ask, I demand.
We talked about assume breach. So we don't know if there's breaches, but in the assume breach mentality, like what are the 3 things that people should be doing now? Mike, you want to start? Yeah,
well, there's more than 3. First of all, lock out the Tyler logins if you haven't already, because they even came out and said this. I mean, as soon as I saw the press release, it's like, you got ransomware today. They've been in there for some amount of time. They've been watching what you do. They've been watching what ports are open. We should assume that credentials have been disclosed and are being used against us. And in fact, there's been a couple of reports of that. So that looks like a pretty good assumption, right? So lock out the Tyler logins. If there's some they tell you they don't want them locked out, lock them out. Sort it out later. If they need in, they'll knock. I would see go to your firewall, as John Luke said, and see if there are any Tyler specific rules in place. And if they include 1433, I think you should start looking at your SQL and your application logs specifically for, that Tyler Connect, and maybe some other applications too, because I'm not that familiar with this portfolio. It's huge. But start looking for large data transmissions that you cannot explain. That may have been the data that got poached that's going to be used against you later. I would really focus monitoring on Tyler applications. And if you're aggregating logs and you can set thresholds for alerting, I would definitely take whatever steps I could to increase my monitoring of those applications. again, and I'm just reiterating what's already been said, review your third-party security management, and especially how that remote access works, right? If these guys are, and I'm seeing in the comments, right, these guys come and go as they please, and this is what we were told with a customer that I won't disclose, and we were planning on going to Tyler about this multi-factor authentication and the lack of it on this Munis system and saying, hey, can you guys get this fixed? And then all this stuff went down. So definitely review Munis and Tyler Connect application logs for unexplained logins. If you suspect that unauthorized actors have accessed these systems or exfiltrated data, start running a security tool to detect what may be there. Look for signatures for this ransom EXX and make sure you got a tool that might see this or other compromises that may be subsequent to this. It is likely that they've had enough time to drill in. And my concern, setting aside 23 cities in Texas, my concern is counties, because counties run elections. And counties, I will tell you with a good deal of authority, are pretty easy to knock over. Right? We need the funding that the federal government is discussing right now, specifically to go out to state and local government for reasons like this. But my terrible thought is that coming up to election time, a whole bunch of mines that have been planted and fuses that have been set are going to go off. And what that's going to do, whether or not this is extortion or just made to look like it, my fear is that elections are going to get snarled. And even if it doesn't affect the counting or the tally, the perception created will be that tallies cannot be trusted. That is my fear. So, if you got to start running a detection tool on stuff, get after it, right? If you've gone through these other processes and look to see if there's any evidence that something looks weird, start running a detection tool, bring in some people to help if you can. If you find any suspicious log entries, you should preserve those. Federal law enforcement should be contacted. And really just try to preserve evidence as best you can, because if this thing goes down, we're gonna need some evidence to look at and sort it out and hopefully put somebody in jail. That's
April?
I think that's the best thing you can do right now.
I would suggest anyone who's a Tyler customer dump your auth logs, the server logs that host the Tyler gear, and your SQL auth logs, if it's whatever remote access tool that they use, dump the logs for at least 3 months, just so you have it. I mean, you don't know until later, right? Assume breach. So dump the logs so that you have them.
Now, when you say dump, you mean preserve, right?
Yeah,
Preserve,
going back
sorry.
as many
Extract.
months as you can.
Extract. Because sometimes they roll off, right?
Yeah.
So get them before they roll off and you lose that sort
Preserve
of
them.
detail. Yeah.
No, I want to throw my support 150% behind that tip. So we do a number of incident response engagements every month where somebody says, I think I've got XYZ happening. And when we ask about event logs on the server, well, they go back about 4 hours or so because nobody ever set them from something other than default. So yeah, making sure that you've got the logs. Thank you. A couple of other tips that I'm going to throw out there for folks. Something that we see with some ransomware strains. Now, we don't know this for sure about this one that's attached to this incident, but there is a lot of ransomware which will use non-standard or infrastructure services for its CNC or for data exfiltration. A couple of examples of this. There's some malware which is currently using DNS traffic and records for command and control functions or for the actual data exfiltration. It is quietly brilliant. It's also doing really bad stuff inside of your network. So, forget the cool factor and just look at, do I have computers which should not be talking to DNS able to traverse the firewall right now? Inside your network, the only systems that should be able to phone out for DNS lookups are your domain controllers or some other DNS server. Endpoints themselves should not be able to reach out to whatever rando DNS servers they decide. Way too easy for malicious actors or software to come in, hijack those DNS settings and redirect a computer, an endpoint, an IoT device, whatever, to some malicious or corrupted DNS server out on the internet. So if you just tell your firewall, only these systems are allowed out on DNS, and again, only your domain controllers, DHCP servers, anything that's doing those lookups for you, that can help cut down on a bunch of risk right there. Same thing for things like mail gateways, SSH servers or SSH systems, FTP systems. If you don't need that traffic going across your firewall, just block it. stop it. Put a cork in it right then and there, and you'll stop a fair amount of high risk traffic. The reason why I say this is because one investigation we did managed to find ransomware as it was running across a file server. So this had gotten loose on an employee's computer and was using the file shares and just going through one file after another, scrambling the file names and starting to encrypt data. But because the client had blocked outgoing port 8080 at their firewall, the ransomware was not able to phone home and get the latest encryption keys. And so all the files were essentially just being renamed. The data was there, it was still intact. There was no encryption process that had been able to happen, all because of healthy firewall practices there. Now, again, this is just speaking in general. We don't know this specifically about this ransomware, but this is good advice that we hand off to anybody who we do an assessment for or anybody who we're doing technical architecture work for. You want to treat outgoing traffic with a similar level of risk as the incoming traffic. And then, check your ISP traffic logs. Just take a look at your firewalls. Take a look at how much traffic you moved out over the last 6 months. What do the weekly numbers look like? And look for spikes. Spikes are a big telltale indicator that you've got something inside your network that is feeding a lot of data outside your network, and that should absolutely be investigated.
And you mentioned forensics in there. And looking at all of this, if somebody, Mike, has an outside vendor doing security for them, especially monitoring an MSSP, MDR.
That's a good point.
Does that capture? Would that take care of the forensics?
So I can talk about the way we do it. I mean, we can go pretty far back in time with network flow data and know who's knocked on the door, who you've talked to, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we can go back a year. In fact, further than that, if we go pull stuff out of deep freeze. But the logs that you have, if you are a public sector organization and you are being respectful of the retention requirements set by the state, you should have a year of logs going back on things, that they classify as access logs, which encompasses a lot of stuff, like your firewall. That's an access log. So, get after it, and preserve that data now if you think it's going to get overwritten, because we're going to need to look at it. Craig Adams is talking about network traffic, and if you have packet capture data that you have stored, and for our customers, we can go back a few weeks on this, that would be an interesting thing to preserve as well. And so Craig just brought that up, and I think I'm going to get our SOC to actually start doing some of that.
And April, one of the things when we were talking ahead of time is how Seattle Public Schools found out about this.
So we talk among ourselves, and we try to stay up on exploits that are relative to our environments. We did get a notice from Tyler, but it was actually far after we'd started our response process. And I don't know how to make that better. I wish it was safer for a company to admit when there was a problem, and get some sort of a safety buffer that allowed them to send a blast to say, hey, we think there's something going on and here's a heads up. I wish it wasn't quite so defensive and trying to share as little information as possible. I think Tyler actually did a better job than some vendors about saying, hey, yeah, this did happen. Go lock those accounts. I appreciate that. I just wish it would have happened a little faster.
And let me make a point too. What you're saying there, April, were you finished?
Yeah.
Okay. This whole thing about information sharing and the fact that a whole bunch of public sector people started talking right away and sharing notes. The reason we do this is because we all used to meet for quarterly meetings and we all got to know each other. And the entire purpose of doing that was so that we knew who we could call, who we trust, who might know something. And I just want to say in our state, that is working really well. And so I bring it up again, kudos to Kirk Bailey, because it's all about August 15th.
Mike, for those not in the know, what's August 15th?
No, I'm not telling. If you don't know, that's just too bad.
All right, fine then. I also say that every day for the last 12 years, Mike has collated the day's news and sent them out. Whenever he finds something out, he puts it in his daily blast. I'll put in the chat here if you want to sign up for his emails every day, you can click that link and sign up for it. John Luke, I see you're saying something in the chat. What do you? What's this?
Yeah, so Mr. William here noted, why not write extensive reporting requirements into the contracts? If they want your business, they should exceed. NDAs and PCI can be used for protecting information. I agree wholeheartedly. One of the standard things that we recommend when we do assessments for organizations is to say, your contracts with your vendors, your suppliers, your technology service providers currently does not require them to do anything to protect your data. There's no information security handling requirements. There's no information security program requirements. There's no notification or breach reporting requirements. And arguably, even above all those, there's no liabilities, which means if a service provider, a contractor, a vendor, whomever loses their credential because they kept it stored in a text file on their laptop, which they also used for hanging out at home on their couch watching TV, and then that password gets used to compromise your accounts inside your network, which then leads to a data breach. Well, ultimately, I mean, that's kind of on the service provider there. That's on the vendor. But if your contracts don't state, one, you're going to tell us when something happens and you're going to do so within 24 hours, and two, you're going to be responsible for the incident response costs, then you've got nothing to go back to them on that's going to be hard and fast. And so it's going to be a real back and forth battle. So we strongly recommend having information security program terms as well as liabilities and reporting requirements along with penalties if they fail at that. If it says very specifically, you'll let us know in 24 hours if you have a suspected event, and they decide to take 30 days, well, that's technically breach of contract there in a number of ways, but that's something for lawyers to hammer out. I have one other tip, which is probably going to make the IT engineers here cringe, but this is absolutely worth considering, especially if you followed the Maersk ransomware attack from a few years ago, which took down the global shipping line. So their environment was able to come back online because somebody found a domain controller in an isolated part of the network from a site which had been disconnected for something like 6 months. That domain controller still had a copy of the domain and all the authentication data there. It was admittedly long out of date, but that meant it was preserved from the ransomware attack. And it was only because of that domain controller, which was left essentially sitting in a shack in a desert, as far as I can tell, that they were able to bring back their systems and bring back their network. So one recommendation that we have, which is a little off the wall, but has got precedent behind it, promote a domain controller and then unplug it. Set up a domain controller, get it synchronized across your environment, make sure it's got the latest, greatest copy of your domain data, and then disconnect the network cable. You can shut down the DC if you want, but just leave it untouched, essentially, and isolated from the network. That's going to break syncing. It's going to trigger a lot of events and alerts, but it's going to make sure you've got a preserved copy of that domain data there.
Make sure it also has DNS. That will make that process easier.
Thank you. Yes. Now, I would argue making sure it's a GC, like keep it with the global catalog role as well. But yeah, having a system that's available like that, at this point, you can't trust backups solely. And so if all you've got is system state backups or domain backups, don't rely 100% on that. Also, for organizations who are using online backup systems, online as in to a file share or a disk-to-disk backup appliance or something inside your network that is connected to the network, know that it is at risk. A number of incidents that we have worked over the last 6 months or so have involved the ransomware gaining hold of the backup systems and data and taking it down along with the rest of the environment. In a previous webinar last week or so, I walked through a timeline of an incident that we had where the client got called at like 11 o'clock on Monday night from the FBI saying, we see suspicious activity on your public IP address. You might want to look at this. 2 o'clock in the morning, they start getting notified from employees, hey, I can't get my email, I can't sign into the terminal servers. So they get support engaged. They get a vendor support person on the line. 4 in the morning, vendor support person finds a ransomware note left on the system. They have to go hands off at that point. There's nothing they can do. They say, I have to engage my security team. I cannot continue to support getting this system back up and running. It takes the vendor 3-4 hours to get the security team on the phone. By that point, it's 8 o'clock in the morning. Domain controllers, file servers, terminal servers, backup servers, database servers, application servers, toast, all gone that fast. So with these, you don't have days or weeks. There is no thinking time. Once you find out the ransomware has taken hold and is doing its thing, the clock is ticking and you've likely got hours. So Yeah, go ahead.
So let me just bring this back to, Tyler. So let's say you've gone through your logs and you have found suspicious logins, or you saw big bursts of data go out that you cannot explain. Okay. That may mean that you are a ransomware target. And what John Luke is talking about right now, and what April just went through, right? Have a backup copy of a domain controller that's offline. That's if you think the other shoe is going to drop. So, I mean, it's a good practice anyway, but specifically now, because risk is elevated right now for local governments, these are really great steps to take if you think there have been unauthorized accesses through this mechanism.
And April, earlier you were talking about being a Tyler customer and things that that you wish maybe they'd moved a little faster. Let's get into what do you think Tyler should be doing now?
I just posted a little note on there. I wish the vendors would agree to a 24-hour notice, and I'm pretty sure they'd ask for an NDA, which is also complex because we want to share information with our peers, not necessarily broadcast it to the world, but share with our peers about, hey, if you're an XYZ customer, if they all play by the same rules and the vendors are willing to share immediately with their clients, then this back channel stuff wouldn't be necessary, right? The vendors would communicate free and clear, NDAs in place, okay, yep, fine, and we get it fixed. So I'd like to get into that place where vendors feel safer and more willing to share as quickly as they can, so that we're all in a better place, because right now we're not. We're making guesses, best guesses as we can. And I don't think it's helping us stop the bad guys.
Yeah, well, sadly, some of the decisions made by companies like this have everything to do with shareholder value and less to do with their customers. And that's just a sad artifact of, the way we do business. And so just to pile on there, I'll say Tyler's earnings call is November 2nd.
So, but I, this idea that April has, push for a 24-hour notice. How do we make that happen? I mean, this is something that has to happen.
Well, I think if enough people, are demand it, and we can actually get enough fingerprints on that demand, and it sounds like there is a pretty big market out here that we can talk to. Setting those standards and holding a vendor to a standard. We do that every day. It's just this vendor is so damn big. It's going to take a little bit of clout to, implement some practices here. And frankly, we don't know what's happening at Tyler. My assumption is, the FBI are in there with Q-tips and toothpicks right now. And once all this comes out, I am sure that part of it is going to be how processes need to improve, and they are going to be extremely public about that. So that's my expectation. What's going to happen? But April is completely right. This is a kind of contractual thing that we ought to be demanding. And frankly, this is what's happening at the regulatory level too. What they talk about is your obligation to report, to tell people when something happens. And I think extending that into third-party relationships makes all the sense in the world.
Well, and to be fair, some of our relationships are pretty old. We've had VersaTrans for a long time. And we've been better about our cybersecurity in our RFP processes. Whenever we go do purchasing now, there's a lot more checks and balances in the process. But the older contracts, we haven't always gone back and fixed. And so that's one of my other reminders, is for stuff that is continuing, that is kind of pre this whole kind of ransomware world, we really need to go back and clean those contracts up too.
So Annie's making a good point here, right? Creating a time buffer to share information is not a recipe for collaboration. This is definitely something we should think through before trying to advocate this. And again, we need to see, what Tyler is going to be obligated or willing to do at the end of this. But generalizing, abstracting this notion, I think I'm a real fan of the obligation to report. I will point out that there are certain prohibitions or protections in place, so that if there is an ongoing investigation, there is no requirement to report. And generally that investigation starts the day they get smacked, with some kind of disruption event, plus or minus extortion. So it might be a little hard to enforce that. Jake, you're on mute.
Let's see. I knew I'd do that at some point. Oy. As we get towards 12:50 here, and I see some folks dropping off, I do want to share if people want to get in touch with JLP or Mike, their email addresses are here. Their LinkedIn is here. I'll also put them in the chat. But this is about making sure that you're not calling us for incident response. That's not. I don't want to answer your call Saturday night, as mentioned before. The other thing here that I think is important is talking to the people on the call about, okay, you get off this call here. And, I see there are some IS managers, there are some people who are analysts. People need to go tell their boss something. How do you take a situation like this where you don't necessarily know, and talk to your boss, your board, your council, whatever about it? April?
Well, we're going to go back and do two things. We're going to make sure that we finish the assume breach, finish those activities, pulling those logs, doing the reviews, cleaning up what we need to clean up. We'll also use the opportunity to update our processes. I need to update my incident response plan, especially the vendor subsection, because I'm missing some stuff in there. Not all of the service accounts are there. Not all of the firewall rules are in there. I need to know where to go very quickly when something like this happens. So I'll use it as a learning opportunity and an opportunity to maybe have some of those conversations that maybe we tend to avoid. And again, like I said, we're trying to get better at this. And I'd like to make this a cooperative effort, both with my executive team and with the vendors. We can take these opportunities to improve both our processes and our vendor processes, and I hope that's what happens.
So Jake, can we distribute, kind of basic talking points that we just went through here to everybody so that if they need an artifact or a primer, maybe to go, brief executives or something like that, they would have that? Can we do that?
Yeah, we'll put that together today and we'll email it out to folks here along with a link to the recording of this meeting. I see Ray's asking for a recording. So we'll send that out to everybody. So if you registered with your real email address, you'll get that. If you faked an email address, you won't, in which case you can just email Mike and say, hey, Mike, give me the email. But hey, Mike, in terms of talking to other folks in the organization, talking to a council, talking to board, April gave her take. What's your take?
Well, I would not use, the FUD technique, and say we're about to tip over. What I'd say is we have a service provider that's had persistent logins to us. That provider was compromised, and we've done everything we can to lock them out and look for unauthorized access. But this is an ongoing thing, and we need to be aware of it. And that's probably how I'd communicate that, right? I don't want to, set anybody's hair on fire here, because I think the right thing to do is investigate, look at logs, and monitor right now. And if you find evidence, that's when it's time to escalate, and that's when it's time to start taking some actions like pulling the trigger on, we need to scan every computer in here with a product that is not our endpoint product or our antivirus agent, because if that would work, it would have worked. So definitely use something different.
John Luke, you look like you want to respond to that.
No, he's just laughing at me.
Yeah, because he's 100% right. So I personally am a big fan of Microsoft's Defender ATP product. It's still 80 to 95% effective. There's 10% of badware out there that it's not going to see. That's potentially something that's custom crafted for an organization or just something that slips by. And the same is true for any and all antivirus vendors. There is no single product out there that is 100%. So I think that MO that April laid out here and the follow-up tools using a different tool, the follow-up scans using a different tool from what you're currently running is absolutely the best way to go. yeah, I was laughing because
and-
Mike hit a good point there.
And Mike's going to kill me for this, but I wouldn't be the branding marketing guy if I didn't say it's now called Defender for Endpoint. Microsoft rebranded it, and CI Security now has an integration, so our analysts can watch Defender for Endpoint, formerly known as Defender ATP. Not that Microsoft has ever changed the name of a product before. All right, we got a couple of minutes left. Final thoughts. JLP, you're the last one talking. Final thoughts.
Assume breach, check out your own systems with a suspicious eye, and yeah, this is a good opportunity to batten down some hatches, take a look at what you've got set up in your technology and your current vendor management practices, and look for opportunities for improvement. I think it is important, like Mike said, not to freak out your executive staff, but this is a good way to come in and say, we have a vendor, this vendor's been doing a thing for us, this vendor is now a risk, here's what we need to do to manage it. And it may mean that you have to pull people away from some projects or some tasks for a short amount of time so that they can focus on this in the way that they need to. But this is absolutely one of those issues and incidents which you want to have somebody looking at right now. Don't wait and let it happen in the background after hours over the next few weeks when somebody can get to it, because there is a very real chance that by the point that they have the time to invest in it or that they find something, it may be too late.
April?
Take the opportunity to improve your practice. Look at your risks, prioritize, and respond and iterate. Don't let perfect be the enemy of good, right? Go in and make sure you have an incident response plan and that you have enough of it defined that you can execute on it. Because at least from my point of view, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when.
So I'll wrap us here. One other thing that we haven't discussed is indicators. And to the extent that the federal law enforcement is in Tyler right now, what they will come up with are indicators, right? Look for these things on your network, look for these destination addresses you may have spoken with, et cetera, et cetera. In order for you to go back months, which is what it might take, preserve your logs. But let me just talk real quick. Indicators, when the feds have them, they have a lot of process to go through. And what they eventually release is of extremely high fidelity, but it takes a while. So we share information like this just to kind of raise the flag and say, radar up, look at your logs, see if anything's been going on. But there's still another burst of information that will come that will really facilitate searching for whether or not you have been swept up in this.
Great. Thank you. And again, we're going to email everybody. I want to thank everybody who came, and wow, the comments here are,
wow.
There are a lot of great comments. So read what your colleagues are saying here, especially the ones who are thanking us. No, I'm just kidding. The ones who have great tips here. I have to tell everybody, we thought we'd have 10, 15, 20 people here. 110 people came to this, high interest. And again, we just want everybody to be safe, have good defense, and be wary when things like this come up, so that we're all in this together. Mm-hmm. Thank you, everybody. Have a good day. If you're in Seattle, stay out of the smoke.
Yep. Bye, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
And have an espresso. What was it? An espresso?
Chocolate covered
espresso. Be like April, chocolate covered espresso.
Be like April. Bye.
Be like April. Bye.